The 1960s was a time where the science fiction genre first became mainstream in literature, film, and television. Authors like Isaac Asimov, P.K. Dick, Kurt Vonnegut all came to prominence in the 60s. TV series such as Star Trek also popularized the genre, and sci-fi even began to spread into children's programming. A pioneer in this field was British television producer Gary Anderson, who produced a number of TV series with a sci-fi theme. Anderson used an innovative technique called supermarionation, which was the use of sophisticated puppets and models. This enabled the use of spectacular small-scale sets, but also allowed Anderson to create multiple different immersive and imaginative universes, the most popular of which was Thunderbirds.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thunderbirds are go.
Thunderbirds was a show which ran between 1965 and 1966, with 32 episodes across 2 seasons. The series was still broadcast on British television until the 1980s and was distributed to 30 countries, including the US. The show is based on an episodic form of storytelling, where the central premise is that an American industrialist, Jeff Tracy, has set up a group called International Rescue. International Rescue uses a series of spacecraft, aircraft, and submersibles with advanced technology to save those in peril around the world. What I find interesting about Thunderbirds, and indeed all sci-fi, is how much it represented the society in which it was made. For Thunderbirds, it represents the last years of post-war prosperity in the West, where America and Britain believed that the future was bright, peaceful, prosperous, and that they would lead it. For instance, look at the makeup of International Rescue. The action characters are all white and English-speaking, very much indicative of how Britain and America saw themselves in the 60s. Those who are white and English-speaking were considered the true good boys. The Germans and the French were not quite in the club as they didn't speak English, but they were fine. And anyone behind the Iron Curtain were the baddies. On that point, the main recurring villain in the show is the Hood, who is portrayed as this Central Asian Mongolian type fellow. The things that go wrong in the show are a result of a pure accident, the hubris engineer, or a terror attack by the Hood. In terms of women, there are certainly female characters in Thunderbirds, but they mostly play second fiddle to the main male cast. The closest you get is Lady Penelope, but she seldom participates in action scenes. Even then, most of the dirty work is handled by her butler, Parker. It should also be noted that there are almost no black characters in Thunderbirds, none of which have an impact on the show. Thunderbirds was made before the Revolutionary Year of 1968, before the assassinations of MLK and Bobby Kennedy, as well as the passing of the Civil Rights Act. And it was made before the sexual revolution of the 70s. It would be very difficult to imagine the same assumptions about race and gender made in Thunderbirds had it been produced just a few years later. Thunderbirds shows that the meta-narrative of the 60s in the West was that of prosperity and peace led by the white man. Furthermore, Thunderbirds also shows how America, and to an extent Britain, saw themselves on an international stage. Here you have this rich, white American family allowed to own a private island and fly spacecraft, and who also devotes their massive fortune to save people from their own incompetence or mistakes, or a meddling Asiatic. It's analogous to how America saw its role in the world in the 60s. It's this prosperous, capitalist society that's way ahead of everyone else in almost every regard, an institution that intervenes in affairs all over the world for the sake of peace, safety, and democracy, and as the vanguard of the fight against terrorism. To the average Western viewer at the time, Thunderbirds showed a comforting future, one in which the view of society was the dominating narrative. Again, being produced in the 60s, Thunderbirds missed out on the pivotal year of 1973, where the Yom Kippur War caused the oil crisis and recession in the West, a year where the events of Watergate came to light, and America was forced into a humiliating withdrawal from Vietnam. In the 70s, the Pax Americana and post-war economic boom were replaced by a sense of economic and national anxiety. American dominance of the world was called into question, and Thunderbirds shows that the last few years are the peak of the Pax Americana, and how Western society viewed themselves in that period. Another interesting aspect of Thunderbirds is that it shows how the West viewed the future of technology in the 60s. Look at how nuclear technology is viewed in Thunderbirds. In the episode Trapped in the Sky, the supersonic passenger liner Fireflash uses a nuclear reactor as its main form of propulsion, and all of International Rescue's vehicles use some form of fusion reactor. There is an assumption in the 60s that the future was atomic, an assumption shattered by incidents like Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island. Another facet of this was that there is no visible threat of pollution in Thunderbirds. There is no threat to the natural environment and no climate change. It's all part of the belief in the 60s that because the present was prosperous, the future was prosperous. And just a few years later, with the wave of environmentalism, again, Thunderbirds would have been a very different show if it was produced just a few years later. In later science fiction, especially in the 80s with films like RoboCop and Terminator, technology was seen as a more dangerous thing than anything else. Lastly, the show also lends an interesting viewpoint as to how Britain specifically viewed herself in the world. Despite being produced in Britain and made by Brits, the show is centered around Americans. We didn't have the nerve to suppose that the rich industrialist or that any of the action characters would be British. The main British presence in the show is Lady Penelope, but she mostly engages in covert actions and reconnaissance, rather than being the main driving force behind a rescue. Most of the time, at least. It's indicative of how Britain viewed herself in the 60s, especially in relation to America. By that time, we'd given up our independent space program and nuclear deterrence. The viewpoint in Britain was that we would still be important, it's just that we'd play a supporting role to the Americans. The reason why an analysis of Thunderbirds and properties like it is so important is because science fiction's view of the future is a great way to analyse the world in which it was written. Thunderbirds was a representation of children's science fiction and was especially tuned towards a simple, easily understood view of the future. Thunderbirds is a great representation of the last few years of the post-war assumptions of a benign, American-led, prosperous future. Could one imagine the assumptions of Thunderbirds being true 10 years later? Where the war in Vietnam had ended in abject failure, Watergate was in full swing, the oil crisis, civil rights and sexual politics had changed society hugely, everything changed so fundamentally in just 10 years. Sci-fi in the mid-70s was much more pessimistic, tech was seen as much more evil, and American domination had mostly ended, and the role of women and racial minorities in shows was seen as much more important. Thunderbirds is a fascinating cultural artifact of the last gasp of the post-war Western cultural assumptions.